The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the corner office where Marcus sat alone, reviewing quarterly reports while his colleagues gathered around the water cooler, sharing weekend stories and inside jokes. At 34, he had climbed higher in the corporate hierarchy than most men his age, yet the view from his elevated position revealed a landscape of profound isolation. His sharp analytical mind, which had propelled him to success, had simultaneously erected invisible barriers between himself and the world around him. This scene plays out in countless variations across modern society. In research laboratories, university halls, technology firms, and executive boardrooms, highly intelligent men find themselves trapped in a peculiar form of social exile. The very cognitive abilities that society celebrates and rewards become the source of their deepest loneliness. The brutal truth is that intelligence, particularly high intelligence, creates a chasm between the individual and the masses that few can bridge without sacrificing essential parts of themselves. The phenomenon extends far beyond simple social awkwardness or introversion. It represents a fundamental misalignment between cognitive capacity and social integration, where the price of intellectual gifts is often paid in social currency. The intelligent man faces a cruel paradox: the more he develops his mental faculties, the fewer people can relate to his perspective, understand his concerns, or appreciate his insights without feeling threatened or diminished by comparison. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist specializing in giftedness, observed this pattern repeatedly in her research. She noted that men with IQs above 130 reported significantly higher rates of social isolation, relationship difficulties, and what she termed cognitive loneliness, the feeling that no one truly understands their thought processes or shares their intellectual curiosity. The isolation isn't merely about being alone, it's about being fundamentally misunderstood in a world that simultaneously values and resents intellectual capability. The roots of this isolation begin early, often manifesting in childhood when gifted boys first recognize their difference from peers. Young Marcus had discovered this truth at age 8 when he attempted to share his fascination with quantum physics concepts with classmates who were still struggling with basic multiplication. The blank stares and eventual mockery taught him his first lesson in the social cost of intelligence. Revealing the full extent of one's cognitive abilities invites ridicule, resentment, and rejection. As these boys mature into men, they learn to mask their intelligence, dumbing down their vocabulary, hiding their interests, and pretending enthusiasm for conversations that bore them to tears. This intellectual masquerade becomes second nature, a survival mechanism in a world that celebrates intelligence in theory but punishes it in practice. The intelligent man learns to code switch between his authentic intellectual self and his socially acceptable persona, leading to a profound sense of fragmentation and alienation. The workplace presents its own unique challenges for the intellectually gifted man. While his analytical abilities may earn him promotions and recognition, they also create interpersonal friction that can undermine his career advancement and social standing. Colleagues may interpret his thorough analysis as pedantic nitpicking, his innovative suggestions as implicit criticism of existing methods, and his ability to quickly grasp complex concepts as showing off or making others feel inadequate. James Rodriguez experienced this firsthand during his tenure as a software architect at a major technology firm. His ability to identify potential system vulnerabilities and propose elegant solutions was valued by management but resented by peers who felt intellectually overshadowed. Team meetings became minefields where his contributions, no matter how diplomatically presented, seemed to create tension and resentment among colleagues. The very skills that made him excellent at his job isolated him from the collaborative relationships that make work environments enjoyable and psychologically healthy. The isolation deepens when intelligent men attempt to form romantic relationships. Dating becomes a complex navigation of when and how much of their true intellectual selves to reveal. Too little, and the relationship lacks depth and authenticity. Too much, too soon, and potential partners may feel intimidated, inadequate, or simply bored by interests and conversation topics that seem esoteric or pretentious. Many highly intelligent men report feeling like they must choose between intellectual honesty and romantic connection, a choice that often leaves them either alone or in unsatisfying relationships built on pretense. The phenomenon becomes more complex when considering the social dynamics at play. Intelligence, particularly verbal and analytical intelligence, can be perceived as a threat to others' self-esteem and social status. When an intelligent man offers insights, suggestions, or corrections, others may experience it as an attack on their competence or worth, even when no such intention exists. This creates a defensive response that manifests as social rejection, gossip, or active hostility toward the intelligent individual. The dark psychology underlying this isolation reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and social hierarchies. Society's relationship with intelligence is deeply ambivalent. While we ostensibly value and reward intellectual achievement, we also harbor deep-seated resentments and insecurities about cognitive differences. The intelligent man becomes a mirror that reflects others' intellectual limitations, creating discomfort that people resolve by excluding or diminishing the source of their discomfort. This dynamic is particularly pronounced in male social groups, where intelligence can be perceived as challenging traditional masculine hierarchies based on physical prowess, social dominance, or emotional charisma. The intelligent man who lacks these other attributes may find himself relegated to the margins of male social networks, valued for his problem-solving abilities but excluded from the bonds of genuine friendship and brotherhood that form around shared experiences and emotional connections. The psychological toll of this isolation compounds over time, leading many intelligent men to develop what researchers term gifted adult syndrome, a cluster of symptoms including perfectionism, existential depression, intense sensitivity to criticism, and a profound sense of being different or alien. The constant need to modulate one's intellectual expression to avoid social rejection creates chronic stress and authenticity conflicts that can manifest in anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties. Marcus found himself questioning whether his intellectual gifts were ultimately a blessing or a curse as he sat in his empty apartment on yet another Friday night, surrounded by books that fascinated him but unable to share his enthusiasm with anyone who might understand or appreciate his insights. The promotion that his colleagues envied had come at the cost of their friendship and respect, leaving him professionally successful but personally isolated. The modern digital age has provided some relief for isolated intelligent men through online communities, forums, and social networks that connect people with similar intellectual interests and capabilities. These platforms allow for authentic intellectual expression without the immediate social consequences that face-to-face interactions might bring. However, digital connections, while valuable, cannot fully replace the human need for in-person relationships, physical presence, and the complex emotional bonds that form through shared experiences and mutual understanding. The burden of high intelligence extends beyond social isolation to include what psychologists call the curse of awareness. Highly intelligent individuals often see problems, patterns, and potential consequences that others miss or ignore. This enhanced perception can be psychologically overwhelming, leading to what some researchers term smart person syndrome, chronic worry, analysis paralysis, and difficulty finding peace in ignorance or simple pleasures that might satisfy others. In romantic relationships, this awareness can be particularly challenging. Intelligent men may analyze their relationships to death, seeing potential problems before they manifest, recognizing incompatibilities that their partners haven't noticed, or becoming frustrated with partners who seem content with surface-level interactions when they crave deeper intellectual and emotional connections. The very analytical skills that serve them well in professional contexts can sabotage their personal relationships. The isolation experienced by intelligent men is often exacerbated by their own psychological patterns and defense mechanisms. Having learned early that their true selves are often unwelcome in social situations, many develop what psychologists call intellectual arrogance as a protective strategy. If others are going to reject them anyway, they reason, they might as well maintain their sense of superiority and dismiss those who cannot appreciate their insights. This defensive arrogance creates a vicious cycle. The intelligent man's dismissive attitude toward others' intellectual limitations further alienates him from potential friends and romantic partners, confirming his belief that he is surrounded by intellectual inferiors and justifying his isolation. What began as a defense mechanism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that perpetuates his loneliness while protecting his ego from the pain of rejection. The corporate world presents particularly complex challenges for intelligent men seeking to balance authenticity with social acceptance. Success in most organizations requires not just technical competence but also emotional intelligence, political savvy, and the ability to build coalitions and influence others. The intelligent man who focuses solely on technical excellence while neglecting these softer skills may find his career stalled despite his obvious capabilities. Thomas Park, a brilliant engineer in the aerospace industry, discovered this truth when he was passed over for promotion despite consistently delivering innovative solutions to complex technical problems. His manager explained that while his technical contributions were invaluable, his inability to communicate effectively with non-technical stakeholders and his tendency to dismiss colleagues' input had limited his advancement potential. The very intellectual confidence that drove his technical success had become a liability in his professional relationships. The educational system often fails to prepare intelligent men for these social realities. Academic environments typically reward pure intellectual achievement without adequately developing emotional intelligence or social skills. Many gifted students graduate with advanced technical knowledge but limited understanding of how to navigate the complex interpersonal dynamics that dominate most professional and personal relationships. This educational gap becomes apparent when intelligent men enter the workforce and discover that success requires more than just being the smartest person in the room. They must learn to package their insights in ways that don't threaten others, to give credit generously even when they've done most of the intellectual heavy lifting, and to build genuine relationships based on more than shared intellectual interests. The path forward for intelligent men facing isolation requires a fundamental shift in perspective about the relationship between intelligence and social connection. Rather than viewing their cognitive abilities as barriers to relationship, they must learn to see them as tools that can enhance rather than hinder meaningful connections when wielded with emotional intelligence and genuine empathy. This transformation begins with developing what Daniel Goleman termed emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize, understand, and manage one's own emotions while effectively navigating the emotions of others. For intelligent men, this often means learning to value different types of intelligence and recognizing that intellectual giftedness is just one dimension of human capability and worth. The second part of this journey involves learning to communicate insights and ideas in ways that invite collaboration rather than highlighting differences in cognitive ability. This requires developing skills in active listening, asking genuine questions about others' perspectives, and finding common ground that transcends intellectual disparities. The goal isn't to hide one's intelligence but to express it in ways that build bridges rather than barriers. Marcus began this transformation when he started volunteering at a local literacy program, teaching reading skills to adults who had missed educational opportunities earlier in life. This experience taught him that intelligence takes many forms and that his cognitive gifts were most valuable when used in service of others rather than as sources of personal superiority. The gratitude and respect he earned from his students helped heal some of the wounds created by years of social isolation and professional friction. The journey from isolation to integration also requires intelligent men to develop genuine humility about the limitations of intellectual intelligence. While cognitive abilities are valuable and important, they represent only one aspect of human wisdom and capability. Emotional wisdom, social intelligence, practical skills, creative abilities, and moral insight all contribute to a complete human being and a fulfilling life. This recognition opens doors to appreciating and learning from people who may not match one's intellectual capabilities but who possess other forms of wisdom and insight. The construction worker who understands human nature through decades of practical experience, the artist who expresses truths that logic cannot capture, the caregiver who demonstrates emotional intelligence through daily compassion, all have valuable perspectives that can enrich the intellectual man's understanding of life and relationships. The transformation from isolation to connection requires patience, practice, and often professional guidance. Many intelligent men benefit from therapy specifically focused on social skills development, emotional intelligence training, and addressing the deep-seated beliefs and defense mechanisms that perpetuate their isolation. Support groups for gifted adults can provide safe spaces to explore these challenges with others who share similar experiences. As the modern world becomes increasingly complex and knowledge-based, society needs intelligent men who can apply their cognitive gifts effectively while building the relationships necessary to implement meaningful change. This requires a new model of intellectual leadership that combines analytical rigor with emotional wisdom, technical expertise with genuine empathy, and innovative thinking with collaborative spirit. The most successful intelligent men of the future will be those who learn to integrate all aspects of their humanity, intellectual, emotional, social, and spiritual, into coherent wholes that can contribute meaningfully to their communities while maintaining authentic, satisfying personal relationships. This integration doesn't require diminishing one's intellectual gifts but rather expanding one's definition of what it means to be truly intelligent. The dark psychology that creates isolation for intelligent men stems from fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of intelligence, success, and human connection. By addressing these misunderstandings and developing a more complete approach to human development, intelligent men can transform their greatest potential liability into their greatest strength, using their cognitive gifts to build rather than barriers the connections that make life meaningful and fulfilling. The brutal reason intelligent men are isolated is not that intelligence itself is a curse, but that our society has failed to develop models for integrating intellectual giftedness with emotional wisdom and social connection. The men who overcome this isolation are those who refuse to accept the false choice between intellectual authenticity and human connection, instead forging new paths that honor both their cognitive gifts and their fundamental human needs for belonging, understanding, and love. Dr. William Hayes sat across from his therapist, his hands trembling slightly as he recounted the moment his carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. At 42, he had built an impressive career as a neurosurgeon, earned the respect of his peers, and accumulated the external markers of success that society demanded. Yet beneath the polished exterior lived a man consumed by self-doubt, paralyzed by perfectionism, and desperately seeking validation from others whose opinions he secretly despised. The breaking point came during a routine surgery when a younger colleague questioned his technique. Instead of responding with the confident authority his position warranted, William felt his throat constrict, his hands shake, and his mind flood with self-recrimination. The weak self that he had fed and nurtured through decades of people-pleasing and external validation had finally rendered him unable to function in the moment when his expertise was most needed. This crisis forced William to confront a brutal truth that many intelligent men eventually face: the weak self that seeks approval, avoids conflict, and defines worth through external validation is not just a minor personality flaw but a fundamental threat to authentic existence and meaningful achievement. The destruction of this weak self is not optional for men who wish to reach their full potential. It is an essential transformation that determines whether they will live as authentic leaders or remain trapped in elaborate performances designed to earn acceptance from others. The weak self manifests in countless ways throughout a man's life, often masquerading as virtues while actually representing fundamental character flaws. It appears as the excessive need for consensus before making decisions, the inability to express unpopular opinions, the compulsive drive to be liked by everyone, and the chronic fear of failure that prevents bold action. The weak self convinces men that their worth depends on others' opinions while simultaneously making them incapable of earning genuine respect. Marcus Thompson recognized these patterns in his own behavior during a pivotal moment in his career as a financial analyst. He had identified a significant flaw in his firm's investment strategy that could potentially save millions of dollars, but presenting this analysis would require challenging senior partners who had developed the flawed approach. For weeks, he agonized over whether to speak up, his weak self generating endless scenarios of potential rejection, humiliation, and career damage. The weak self whispered its familiar refrains: what if you're wrong? What if they think you're arrogant? What if this damages your relationships with important people? These fears paralyzed Marcus, preventing him from acting on insights that his analytical mind had clearly identified as valuable. The weak self had transformed his intelligence into a weapon of self-sabotage, using his capacity for detailed analysis to generate elaborate justifications for inaction and cowardice. The psychological roots of the weak self often trace back to childhood experiences where intelligent boys learn that their natural assertiveness and intellectual confidence are unwelcome or even dangerous. Parents, teachers, and peers may respond to displays of intellectual superiority with rejection, punishment, or emotional withdrawal, teaching young minds that survival requires hiding their true capabilities and seeking approval through conformity and people-pleasing. David Reeves experienced this pattern early when his elementary school teacher publicly humiliated him for correcting her factual error during a history lesson. The message was clear: intellectual superiority must be hidden, authority figures must not be challenged, and safety lies in making others comfortable rather than pursuing truth. This single incident shaped decades of behavior patterns where David learned to present diluted versions of his insights, always couched in apologetic language and deferential tone. The weak self becomes more entrenched during adolescence when social acceptance takes on critical importance. Intelligent young men learn to code switch between their authentic intellectual selves and socially acceptable personas that won't threaten peers or authority figures. This constant performance creates a split consciousness where the authentic self becomes increasingly foreign and the performed self becomes the default mode of operation. By adulthood, many intelligent men have become so skilled at this performance that they lose touch with their authentic preferences, opinions, and desires. They can analyze complex problems with brilliant clarity but cannot decide what restaurant to choose for dinner without polling friends for their preferences. They can lead teams through challenging projects but cannot express simple personal needs without elaborate justifications and apologies. The weak self perpetuates itself through sophisticated defense mechanisms that protect it from confronting its own inadequacy. It develops elaborate rationalizations for avoiding challenges, sophisticated explanations for why taking risks is unwise, and complex philosophical frameworks that justify passivity as wisdom. The intelligent man's analytical abilities become tools for constructing intellectual prisons rather than instruments of liberation and growth. This dynamic becomes particularly destructive in romantic relationships where the weak self seeks validation through romantic partners rather than offering authentic leadership and partnership. Men trapped in this pattern often become what relationship experts term nice guys, individuals who use superficial kindness and excessive accommodation as strategies for earning love and avoiding rejection, while harboring deep resentment when these strategies fail to generate the desired emotional responses. Robert Chen found himself caught in this pattern during his marriage to Sarah, a successful marketing executive who initially appreciated his thoughtful, accommodating nature. However, as their relationship progressed, Sarah became increasingly frustrated with Robert's inability to make decisions, express preferences, or provide emotional leadership during challenging times. His weak self had convinced him that being agreeable would make him more lovable, but the reality was that his constant deference made him less attractive and less trustworthy as a partner. The destruction of the weak self requires a fundamental shift from external validation to internal authority. This transformation begins with the painful recognition that the strategies that felt safe and reasonable for so long have actually prevented the very acceptance and success they were designed to achieve. The weak self's promise that accommodation leads to love and that avoiding conflict leads to respect proves to be a comprehensive lie that has undermined every area of life. This recognition often comes through crisis moments when the weak self's strategies fail spectacularly, forcing a confrontation with reality that can no longer be avoided or rationalized away. For William, it was his inability to function under pressure in the operating room. For Marcus, it was watching a less qualified colleague present his insights and receive credit for the innovation. For Robert, it was his wife's request for divorce based on her feeling that she was married to a pleasant stranger rather than an authentic man. The actual destruction of the weak self requires systematic exposure to the very situations that the weak self has spent years avoiding. This means deliberately seeking challenges that risk failure, expressing opinions that might generate disagreement, and taking stands on principles even when those stands are unpopular or costly. The process is inherently uncomfortable because it requires acting against deeply ingrained behavioral patterns while the weak self generates intense anxiety and elaborate justifications for returning to safe, familiar behaviors. The transformation begins with small acts of authenticity that gradually build confidence in one's ability to survive and thrive without external validation. This might mean disagreeing with a colleague during a meeting, expressing a controversial opinion in social settings, or making decisions based on personal preference rather than what others might approve. Each act of authentic self-expression provides evidence that the weak self's catastrophic predictions about rejection and failure are largely unfounded. Marcus began this process by scheduling a meeting with his senior partners to present his analysis of the flawed investment strategy. His weak self generated intense anxiety for days beforehand, creating elaborate scenarios of professional destruction and public humiliation. However, when he actually presented his findings with confidence and clarity, the partners were impressed with his thoroughness and grateful for his insights. The presentation not only avoided the catastrophe his weak self had predicted but actually enhanced his reputation and career prospects. The process of destroying the weak self often involves confronting deep-seated beliefs about worthiness, safety, and survival that were formed during childhood but no longer serve adult reality. Many intelligent men discover that their fear of rejection stems from early experiences where they genuinely were dependent on others' approval for basic needs like safety, belonging, and emotional support. These survival strategies, while appropriate for dependent children, become obstacles to adult effectiveness and authentic relationships. Therapy or coaching specifically focused on these patterns can be invaluable during this transformation. Professional guidance can help identify the specific triggers, beliefs, and behavioral patterns that maintain the weak self while providing strategies for developing more authentic and effective approaches to relationships and challenges. The process often involves grieving the loss of the familiar, comfortable patterns that have provided a sense of safety even while limiting growth and satisfaction. The destruction of the weak self is not about becoming harsh, insensitive, or domineering. Rather, it involves developing what psychologists call secure attachment, the ability to maintain authentic self-expression while remaining genuinely caring and considerate toward others. This represents a fundamental shift from seeking approval through accommodation to earning respect through competence, integrity, and authentic leadership. As the weak self dissolves, intelligent men often discover capabilities and preferences that have been suppressed for years or decades. They may find themselves naturally gravitating toward leadership roles, expressing opinions with confidence, and making decisions based on their own judgment rather than committee consensus. This emergence of authentic self-expression often surprises both the men themselves and the people around them who have become accustomed to their accommodating personas. The process requires patience and persistence because the weak self does not surrender easily. It will generate intense anxiety when its familiar patterns are challenged, create elaborate justifications for returning to safe behaviors, and interpret initial setbacks as evidence that authentic self-expression is dangerous and should be abandoned. Understanding that this resistance is normal and expected helps men persist through the difficult period of transformation. Robert's journey illustrates this process. After his divorce, he committed to understanding and changing the patterns that had undermined his marriage. Through therapy, he recognized that his excessive accommodation stemmed from childhood experiences with an emotionally volatile father who punished any displays of independence or disagreement. As an adult, Robert had generalized this pattern to all relationships, believing that his safety and acceptance depended on making others comfortable. The transformation required Robert to systematically practice expressing his authentic preferences and opinions in low-stakes situations before applying these skills to more important relationships. He started by choosing restaurants based on his own preferences rather than asking others to decide. He expressed his genuine opinions about movies, books, and political issues even when they differed from those of his friends. He began taking on leadership roles in volunteer organizations where he could practice making decisions and dealing with disagreement. Each of these experiences provided evidence that his authentic self-expression was not only tolerated but often appreciated and respected by others. People began seeking his opinions and advice, recognizing that his thoughtful analysis and genuine insights were more valuable than the pleasant agreements his weak self had offered. When he eventually entered a new romantic relationship, he was able to offer authentic partnership based on his real thoughts, feelings, and preferences rather than a performance designed to earn approval. The destruction of the weak self ultimately reveals a profound truth. The very behaviors that the weak self believes are necessary for acceptance actually prevent the deep connections and genuine respect that every human being craves. People are instinctively drawn to authenticity and repelled by performance, even when they cannot consciously articulate what feels false about excessive accommodation and people-pleasing. This transformation is particularly crucial for intelligent men because their analytical abilities can be either tools of liberation or instruments of self-imprisonment depending on how they are applied. When driven by the weak self, intelligence becomes a weapon of self-sabotage, generating elaborate justifications for inaction and sophisticated rationalizations for avoiding challenge and risk. When liberated from the weak self's influence, intelligence becomes a powerful tool for analyzing situations accurately, making effective decisions, and solving complex problems that benefit both the individual and his community. The man who successfully destroys his weak self emerges with a fundamentally different relationship to challenges, relationships, and his own capabilities. He no longer needs external validation to feel worthy because his worth is rooted in his integrity, competence, and authentic self-expression. He can take risks because his identity does not depend on avoiding failure. He can express unpopular opinions because his sense of belonging does not require unanimous agreement. This transformation is what the ancient Stoic philosophers referred to as becoming unassailable, not because one avoids challenges or criticism, but because one's core sense of self is no longer dependent on external circumstances or others' opinions. The man who has destroyed his weak self cannot be destroyed by others because his essential identity and worth are self-determined rather than externally validated. The journey from weakness to strength, from performance to authenticity, from external validation to internal authority, represents one of the most profound transformations available to human beings. For intelligent men, this transformation is not just personally liberating but socially essential because the world desperately needs leaders who can think clearly, act courageously, and inspire others through authentic example rather than careful performance. The brutal truth is that the weak self will never lead to lasting satisfaction, genuine relationships, or meaningful achievement. It may provide temporary comfort and apparent safety, but it ultimately renders men incapable of the very accomplishments and connections they most desire. The destruction of this weak self, while challenging and uncomfortable, is the price of admission to authentic adulthood and meaningful contribution to the world. The man who completes this transformation discovers that his intelligence, freed from the weak self's constraints, becomes a gift not just to himself but to everyone whose lives he touches through authentic leadership, genuine insight, and courageous action. This is the true fulfillment of intellectual potential, not just thinking clearly, but living authentically and contributing meaningfully to the human experience through the fearless expression of one's highest capabilities. The conference room fell silent as Michael Stewart finished presenting his controversial proposal to restructure the entire customer service department. 3 months earlier, the same man would have hedged his recommendations with apologetic qualifiers, sought unanimous consensus before moving forward, and diluted his insights to avoid challenging anyone's ego. Now, at 38, having undergone the brutal process of destroying his weak self, Michael sat calmly as senior executives peppered him with questions, challenges, and barely concealed hostility. The transformation was not merely cosmetic. Where once he would have felt his chest tighten with anxiety at the first sign of disagreement, Michael now experienced a deep sense of calm rooted in his certainty that his analysis was sound and his recommendations were in the company's best interest. His worth was no longer tied to whether others approved of his ideas, it was anchored in his integrity, competence, and commitment to truth regardless of its popularity. This represents the emergence of what can only be called authentic power, the ability to remain centered, confident, and effective regardless of external pressures, criticism, or attempts at manipulation. The man who has destroyed his weak self and rebuilt his identity on internal rather than external foundations becomes, in the deepest sense, undefeatable. Not because he avoids challenges or never experiences setbacks, but because his essential self cannot be damaged by others' opinions, actions, or attempts at diminishment. The journey to this undefeatable state requires understanding the fundamental difference between external power and authentic power. External power depends on circumstances, positions, other people's recognition, and favorable conditions. It can be given and taken away by forces beyond one's control. A man who builds his identity on external power, job title, wealth, social status, others' admiration, remains vulnerable to any shift in circumstances that threatens these foundations. Authentic power, by contrast, emerges from internal sources that cannot be touched by external circumstances. It stems from self-knowledge, integrity, competence, and the courage to act according to one's principles regardless of consequences. This power grows stronger under pressure rather than weaker, thrives in adversity rather than crumbling under stress, and inspires others through example rather than demanding submission through authority. Dr. James Liu discovered this distinction during a period when his research laboratory faced budget cuts that threatened to eliminate his position and scatter his team. Previously, such a crisis would have sent him into panic mode, desperately politicking to save his position and seeking reassurance from colleagues and superiors. Instead, having undergone his own transformation from weak self to authentic power, James approached the crisis with strategic clarity and emotional equanimity. Rather than focusing on preserving his position, James concentrated on developing the best possible solution for the research mission and his team members. He analyzed the situation objectively, identified creative alternatives that budget-minded administrators hadn't considered, and presented his recommendations with confidence despite knowing they challenged conventional approaches. His calm leadership during the crisis not only saved the laboratory but enhanced his reputation and influence within the organization. The undefeatable man possesses what ancient philosophers called ataraxia, unshakable peace of mind that remains stable regardless of external circumstances. This is not the artificial calm of denial or the brittle composure of suppressed emotions, but, rather, the deep tranquility that comes from knowing one's own nature, accepting responsibility for one's choices, and maintaining clarity about what can and cannot be controlled. This philosophical foundation provides practical benefits in every area of life. In professional settings, the undefeatable man can make difficult decisions without agonizing over others' approval, can present unpopular truths without fearing rejection, and can maintain focus on long-term objectives despite short-term criticism or setbacks. His colleagues and superiors learn to trust his judgment because it is clearly based on competent analysis rather than political calculation or emotional reaction. The transformation becomes particularly evident in how these men handle criticism and opposition. Where the weak self experiences criticism as an attack on fundamental worth requiring immediate defense or appeasement, the undefeatable man evaluates criticism objectively to determine whether it contains useful information. If the criticism is valid, he incorporates the feedback without emotional drama. If it is invalid, he dismisses it without defensiveness or counterattack. Marcus Rivera exemplified this transformation during a heated board meeting where a longtime colleague accused him of being too aggressive and not collaborative enough in his approach to a major acquisition. The old Marcus would have felt compelled to defend himself, modify his approach to seem more agreeable, or seek support from other board members. The transformed Marcus simply asked for specific examples of where his approach had been counterproductive, listened carefully to the response, and then calmly explained his reasoning while remaining open to alternative suggestions. This response demonstrated several key characteristics of authentic power. First, it showed emotional regulation, the ability to remain calm and rational under pressure. Second, it demonstrated intellectual integrity, the commitment to truth and effective action over ego protection. Third, it revealed secure attachment, the ability to maintain relationships even during disagreement or conflict. These qualities inspired respect even from those who disagreed with Marcus's positions. The undefeatable man's relationship to failure undergoes a fundamental transformation. Rather than experiencing setbacks as threats to his identity, he views them as information about what works and what doesn't in pursuit of his objectives. This shift from emotional reaction to analytical response allows for rapid learning and adaptation that continuously improves performance over time. When Stephen Park's technology startup failed after 18 months of intense effort, his response illustrated this transformation. Previously, such a failure would have triggered months of self-recrimination, depression, and paralysis. Instead, Stephen conducted a thorough analysis of what went wrong, what lessons could be applied to future ventures, and what skills needed development. Within 6 weeks, he had incorporated these insights into a new business plan and was actively seeking investors for his next venture. This resilience stems not from denial of the pain or disappointment that accompanies failure, but from a clear understanding that setbacks are temporary events rather than permanent judgments on one's worth or capabilities. The undefeatable man experiences the full range of human emotions but maintains perspective about their temporary nature and limited significance in the larger context of his life and goals. The emergence of authentic power profoundly impacts relationships with others. People are instinctively drawn to individuals who demonstrate genuine confidence, emotional stability, and the ability to remain centered under pressure. These qualities inspire trust and respect even from those who may disagree with specific positions or decisions. The undefeatable man becomes a natural leader not through manipulation or dominance, but through the magnetic pull of authentic strength and integrity. This transformation is particularly evident in romantic relationships. Women, regardless of their conscious preferences or stated desires, are consistently attracted to men who demonstrate genuine confidence, emotional strength, and the ability to provide stable leadership during challenging times. The man who has destroyed his weak self and developed authentic power offers partnership based on strength rather than neediness, leadership based on competence rather than control, and love based on choice rather than desperation. Dr. Patricia Williams, a relationship therapist specializing in couples counseling, observed this pattern repeatedly in her practice. She noted that relationships involving men who had undergone this transformation showed dramatically lower rates of conflict, higher levels of satisfaction, and greater long-term stability. The women in these relationships reported feeling more secure, more attracted to their partners, and more willing to embrace feminine qualities because they trusted their partners to provide consistent masculine leadership. The undefeatable man's approach to conflict resolution demonstrates his transformed nature. Rather than avoiding confrontation to preserve artificial harmony or becoming aggressive to establish dominance, he addresses issues directly with the goal of reaching mutually beneficial solutions. His emotional regulation allows him to remain calm during heated discussions, his intellectual integrity ensures he focuses on facts rather than personalities, and his secure attachment maintains consideration for others' feelings even during disagreement. This approach often diffuses conflicts that might escalate under different circumstances. People find it difficult to maintain hostility towards someone who remains calm, reasonable, and focused on solutions rather than blame. The undefeatable man's refusal to engage in emotional drama or defensive reactions often inspires others to adopt more constructive approaches to problem solving. The development of authentic power requires continuous cultivation of several key attributes. Self-awareness forms the foundation, the ability to understand one's own motivations, triggers, strengths, and limitations without defensiveness or self-deception. This honest self-assessment allows for continuous improvement and prevents the kind of blind spots that lead to preventable failures. Emotional regulation represents another crucial component. The undefeatable man has developed the ability to experience intense emotions without being controlled by them. He can feel anger without becoming aggressive, experience fear without becoming paralyzed, and face disappointment without becoming depressed. This emotional mastery allows for clear thinking and effective decision-making even under extreme pressure. Intellectual integrity demands commitment to truth over comfort, accuracy over acceptance, and long-term effectiveness over short-term convenience. The undefeatable man has developed the courage to see reality as it is rather than as he wishes it were, to acknowledge mistakes without defensiveness, and to change course when evidence indicates his current approach is ineffective. Physical discipline often accompanies this transformation because the mind-body connection means that physical strength, health, and vitality support psychological resilience and emotional regulation. Many men who successfully destroy their weak selves discover that regular exercise, proper nutrition, and adequate rest are not optional luxuries but essential components of maintaining their transformed state. The undefeatable man's relationship to money and material success reflects his internal transformation. While he may accumulate wealth and achieve external recognition, these accomplishments do not define his worth or determine his happiness. He pursues financial goals as tools for achieving larger objectives rather than as sources of validation or security. This healthy detachment allows for better financial decision-making and prevents the anxiety and desperation that often accompany financial pursuits. Career advancement becomes a natural byproduct of authentic power rather than in desperate pursuit requiring political maneuvering and ego suppression. The undefeatable man's combination of competence, integrity, and leadership naturally attracts opportunities and recognition. Organizations seek out individuals who can be trusted to make difficult decisions, provide honest feedback, and maintain effectiveness under pressure. The spiritual dimension of this transformation cannot be ignored. Many men who successfully destroy their weak selves report a profound shift in their relationship to meaning, purpose, and transcendence. They develop what Viktor Frankl called self-transcendence, the ability to find meaning through contribution to something larger than themselves. This spiritual grounding provides perspective during difficult times and motivation during periods of uncertainty. This spiritual development often leads to what psychologist Abraham Maslow terms self-actualization, the realization of one's highest potential through authentic self-expression and meaningful contribution. The undefeatable man has moved beyond the basic needs for safety, belonging, and esteem to focus on creativity, problem-solving, and service to others. The impact of authentic power extends far beyond personal benefit to influence families, organizations, and communities. The undefeatable man becomes a source of stability and inspiration for others, demonstrating through example that it is possible to maintain integrity while achieving success, to remain compassionate while being strong, and to serve others while honoring one's own authentic nature. Children raised by fathers who have achieved this transformation learn invaluable lessons about resilience, integrity, and authentic strength. They see modeled the possibility of facing challenges with courage rather than avoidance, of pursuing excellence without perfectionism, and of maintaining relationships without sacrificing authenticity. These lessons shape the next generation's understanding of what healthy masculinity looks like in practice. Organizations led by undefeatable men demonstrate higher levels of innovation, employee satisfaction, and long-term success. These leaders create cultures of excellence based on merit rather than politics, encourage honest feedback rather than comfortable agreement, and inspire peak performance through authentic example rather than manipulation or coercion. The journey to becoming undefeatable represents the fulfillment of human potential, not just for intelligent men but for anyone willing to undergo the challenging process of destroying their weak self and rebuilding their identity on authentic foundations. This transformation is available to any individual willing to face the temporary discomfort of abandoning familiar but limiting patterns in favor of unknown but liberating possibilities. The brutal reason intelligent men are isolated dissolves when they complete this transformation. The authentic power that emerges from destroying the weak self naturally attracts others who recognize and appreciate genuine strength, integrity, and leadership. Relationships become deeper and more satisfying because they are based on authentic connection rather than performed personalities. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because his essential identity and worth are no longer dependent on external validation or favorable circumstances. He has achieved what ancient wisdom traditions called liberation, freedom from the psychological chains that bind most people to cycles of seeking approval, avoiding rejection, and defining worth through others' opinions. This freedom enables contribution at the highest levels of human capability. The undefeatable man can pursue truth without fear of unpopularity, can take necessary risks without paralyzing anxiety, and can provide leadership during crisis because his internal foundation cannot be shaken by external chaos. This represents the ultimate expression of human potential, the ability to remain authentically oneself while contributing meaningfully to the larger human story. The transformation from weak self to authentic power represents perhaps the most important journey any man can undertake. It determines whether he will live as a victim of circumstances or as a creator of his own destiny, whether he will seek approval or inspire respect, whether he will be remembered as someone who took up space or someone who made a difference. The choice, ultimately, belongs to each individual man. But, for those who have the courage to undertake this journey, the rewards extend far beyond personal satisfaction to impact every life they touch through their example of what becomes possible when human beings refuse to accept limitation and commit themselves to realizing their highest potential. The undefeatable man stands as proof that human beings need not be prisoners of their conditioning, victims of their circumstances, or slaves to others' opinions. Through the systematic destruction of weakness and the conscious cultivation of authentic power, any man can transform himself into someone who cannot be diminished, discouraged, or defeated by external forces because his strength flows from sources that no other person can touch or damage. This is the ultimate liberation, the freedom to be fully oneself while contributing fully to the world's desperate need for authentic leadership, genuine strength, and unwavering integrity.